right, so today we're diving into something a little bit different.
Okay.
You're out there, you're looking for answers. You want to know how to navigate this crazy thing we call life, especially relationship. Maybe you've tried all the traditional self-help stuff.
Right.
You're like, I'm still not getting it.
It's not working.
So the book that we're going to be looking at today is called Buddhism for the Rational Mind.
Okay.
And this book suggests a path to peace and clarity that's rooted in logic and evidence,
Fascinating.
not just faith.
Right. And it really gets at, like you were saying, that skepticism that I think a lot of people, especially people who are very logically minded or scientifically minded,
Yep.
have towards spirituality.
Fully.
It almost feels like you have to check your brain at the door when you start talking about some of this stuff. And this book really pushes back against that.
It does. And that's one of the things that really attracted me to it
Yeah.
because, look, we all experience
Of course.
in one form or another, right?
Absolutely.
It's just part of life.
Yeah.
The daily grind, struggles in our relationship. And then just this feeling that something's not quite right.
Yeah, that existential angst.
Exactly. And this book claims to offer solutions through, like I said, logic and evidence.
I love that. And it starts with this really fundamental idea in Buddhism, which is this concept of dukkha,
Okay.
which is often translated as suffering, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's more like this pervasive sense of dissatisfaction
I see.
that can exist even when things seem to be going well on the surface.
Right.
Like, you achieve a big goal and you're like, wait, is this it? This is all there is.
It's like that feeling when your favorite song ends.
Yes.
And you're just left with the, regular sounds of traffic.
Exactly. It's that kind of impermanence that really highlights this dukkha.
And that's what I really appreciate about this book. It brings these concepts down to earth. It's not about esoteric rituals or, mystical mumbo jumbo.
Yeah, it's very grounded
It's about understanding why we suffer.
and giving you the tools to actually do something about it.
Exactly. And one of the key insights here is that our suffering isn't necessarily caused by external events.
Right.
It's caused by our reactions to them.
It's about how we cling to how we think things should be.
Okay, so it's not about blaming the world for our problems.
Not at all.
It's about taking responsibility for our own reactions.
Exactly.
But how do we even begin to shift those deeply ingrained patterns?
It's a great question.
Because it's human nature to crave things, to want things to be different.
Right. Absolutely. And the book doesn't suggest that we just suppress these desires or pretend they don't exist.
Right.
Instead, it introduces this framework of the Four Noble Truths
Okay.
as a way to understand and address suffering.
And what are those?
So the first noble truth is simply the acknowledgement that dukkha exists.
Okay.
It's kind of like saying, all right, suffering is part of life.
It is.
Let's not pretend it isn't.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of refreshing.
I think so too.
Because so many self-help gurus try to tell us that we can achieve this constant state of bliss
Right.
if you just follow their program.
Exactly.
But this is about being honest with ourselves.
And then we get to the second noble truth, which is all about understanding the cause of suffering.
Okay, and what does Buddhism say about that?
Well, Buddhism argues that the root of suffering lies in our attachment to impermanent things, our craving for things to be other than they are,
I see.
and our aversion to things that we find unpleasant.
So it's not the events themselves, but our clinging to them.
Exactly.
Our resistance to change.
It's that grasping and that pushing away that really causes the pain.
It makes sense when you put it like that.
The book uses this great example of wealth.
Oh,
The desire for wealth.
which on the surface seems pretty natural.
Right. Who doesn't want to be wealthy?
Yeah.
But the book argues that often this desire for wealth creates more suffering.
How so?
Well, because it's based on impermanence. The fear of losing what you've gained, the constant worry, the striving. It just becomes this endless cycle.
And it's not just about money, right?
No, it applies to anything we grasp onto
Okay.
as a source of lasting happiness.
Relationship status.
All of it.
Yeah, I've definitely fallen into that trap myself.
I think we all have at some point.
Always comparing myself to others, always wanting more.
It's so easy to get caught up in that.
It is. But if that's the cause of suffering, what's the solution?
Right.
Does Buddhism just say, give up everything and become a monk?
Thankfully, no.
Okay, good.
That's where the third and fourth noble truths come in.
Okay, tell me more.
The third truth is that suffering can cease.
That's helpful.
It is. And the fourth truth is that there's a path to achieve that cessation.
There is.
There is. And that path is called the Eightfold Path.
The Eightfold Path.
It's essentially a set of guidelines for cultivating a more mindful and ethical life.
That sounds a bit intimidating.
I know it sounds like a lot, but think of it more like a compass, pointing you towards a life of greater peace and clarity.
All right, so we have this framework of the Four Noble Truths and this path, the Eightfold Path.
Yeah.
But how do we actually walk that path?
That's the real journey, isn't it?
It is, what are the practical tools that Buddhism offers for dealing with the inevitable challenges of life?
Well, that's where things get really exciting, and that's what we'll be diving into next time.
Okay, already.
The book really goes deep into the tools and techniques that Buddhism offers for cultivating a more peaceful and enlightened life.
All right, so we're talking about things like mindfulness, meditation.
Exactly.
Emotional intelligence.
And even practical strategies for things like overcoming procrastination and developing self-discipline.
That's something I'm definitely interested in.
Me too.
But before we get into all of that,
Okay.
maybe we should take a step back
All right.
and talk about how Buddhism reconciles with logic and reason.
Good point.
Because where's the evidence that these ancient principles actually work?
Great. You know, it's one thing to have these teachings, but do they actually hold up in the real world? And that's what's so cool about this book is that it doesn't just present these ancient teachings as like dogma. It actually grounds them in modern science and real world examples.
Okay.
Like it talks about mindfulness and meditation,
Right.
not as these mystical practices, but as practical tools for training the mind.
I see.
Almost like you would train your body at the gym.
Okay, I've heard about mindfulness and meditation, but I'll admit I've always been a bit skeptical.
Yeah.
It all sounds a bit too woo-woo for me.
Right.
But if there's actual evidence,
Yeah.
I'm willing to listen.
And there is, and it's mounting, like the book cites all these studies showing how mindfulness can reduce stress,
Okay.
improve focus, manage pain, and even physically alter the brain.
Wow.
So it's not just about feeling good.
Right.
There are tangible, measurable benefits.
See.
And it talks about how people like Steve Jobs and LeBron James.
Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
I know, right?
I knew he was into Eastern philosophy.
Yeah.
But I never really connected it to his success as a tech innovator.
Yeah.
How did mindfulness play into his work?
Well, you know, Jobs was known for his intense focus and his ability to cut through distraction.
He was.
And he attributed these qualities in part to his meditation practice. He saw mindfulness as a way to cultivate clarity,
Okay.
to really see the essence of things, and to make better decisions.
So it's not just about, relaxation and stress reduction.
No.
It's about enhancing performance.
Yeah.
Even in high pressure environments.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see how this could be valuable.
Yeah.
Even for someone who's not particularly spiritual.
Total. And that's just one example. The book also talks about how mindfulness can help us manage those really difficult emotions,
Okay.
like anger and frustration, in a more constructive way.
That's something I definitely struggle with.
I think we all do, to some extent.
Sometimes I feel like my emotions just get the best of me,
It happens.
especially in those everyday situations like, traffic jams or dealing with difficult people.
Oh, yeah. Those little annoyances that can really get under your skin.
They do. Does the book offer any practical tips for handling those moments?
It does. And it starts with understanding the physiological response that happens when we get angry. Our heart rate increases. Muscles tense, hormones surge.
Right. It's like our body's preparing for battle.
Exactly. It's the fight or flight response.
Yeah.
And it was a super useful response for our ancestors.
Right. When they were facing predators and things.
Exact, but not so helpful
Not so much anymore.
when someone cuts you off on the highway.
So it's about recognizing those physical signs and then choosing a different response.
Easier said than done, I know.
It is.
But that's where mindfulness comes in.
Okay, how so?
Well, it's about being aware of those sensations, those thoughts swirling around in your head
Okay.
without getting swept away by them.
So it's not about ignoring them.
No, it's about observing them.
I see.
The book compares it to being a weather forecaster, noticing the storm clouds gathering
Roughly.
before the downpour.
I like that analogy. It's not about suppressing emotion. It's about becoming more aware of them.
Exactly.
Gaining some distance.
Yes.
So we can choose how to respond.
Exactly.
Are there specific techniques that help with this?
Absolutely. The book suggests things like deep breathing exercises
Okay.
to calm the nervous system.
That makes sense.
It also talks about recognizing your personal trigger.
Okay.
Those situations that tend to push your button.
We all have them.
We do. And if you know that traffic jams make you want to scream,
Yeah.
well, you can mentally prepare beforehand. Maybe listen to some calming music
Right.
or practice some deep breathing.
So it's about being proactive
Exactly.
instead of reactive.
Yes.
Getting ahead of the curve emotionally.
I love that.
But what about when our emotions feel completely irrational?
Okay.
Like we know logically we shouldn't be upset about something, but we still feel those negative feelings bubbling up.
Yeah, that happens. And that's where the book gets really insightful.
How so?
Well, it argues that emotions aren't inherently irrational. They're actually giving us information about our needs and values.
Interesting.
It's our reaction to them that can be irrational.
Okay, I see.
It uses this analogy of a compass.
Okay.
Emotions are like a compass pointing us toward what matters to us. And if we ignore them,
Then what?
well, then we're trying to navigate without a map.
That's a really helpful way to think about it.
I think so too.
So instead of trying to ignore or suppress our emotion,
Yeah.
we should try to understand what they're trying to tell us.
Exactly.
But how does all of this connect back to the idea of finding peace and clarity?
Right, because that's what we're ultimately after.
It is.
And here's where it all ties together.
Okay.
Buddhism really emphasizes the importance of self-discipline, of training the mind to resist distractions and to make choices that are aligned with our values.
Right.
And the book argues that understanding and managing our emotions is a key aspect of this self-discipline.
So it's not just about willpower.
I know.
It's about using emotional intelligence.
Exact, to make wise decisions.
So instead of being controlled by our emotions, we can learn to become the masters of our own emotional landscape.
Yes, and that mastery leads to greater peace and clarity because we're not constantly reacting to every emotional wave that comes along.
Makes sense. Are there any specific practices or techniques that the book recommends?
For developing self-discipline?
Yeah.
Absolutely. It suggests starting with an honest assessment of your current self-discipline levels. Set achievable goals, create new habits, gradually increase your ability to resist temptation.
So baby steps.
Yeah, exactly. It's about making small changes, building momentum, and not getting discouraged when you slip up.
So it's a process.
It is.
Not a quick fix.
Exactly. And it sounds like mindfulness plays a role here too.
It does.
Yeah. Mindfulness meditation can help us become more aware of our thoughts and impulses,
Okay.
which gives us the space to choose how to respond.
I see.
And the book debunks this myth
Oh.
that meditation is about emptying your mind.
Yeah, I've heard that.
It's not. It's more about training your mind
Did you do what?
to focus on the present moment.
Okay.
To observe your thoughts and feelings without judgment.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit
It's
together.
all interconnected.
Mindfulness helps us understand our emotions, which in turn helps us develop self-discipline,
Exactly.
which ultimately leads to a greater sense of peace and clarity.
It's a beautiful cycle.
It is. But what about those really tough challenges, like procrastination?
Oh, yes, the nemesis of productivity.
Does Buddhism offer any insights into overcoming that?
It does, and it takes a fascinating approach.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
The book argues that procrastination is essentially the avoidance of discomfort,
Okay.
however temporary that discomfort may be. So by understanding that underlying motivation,
Yeah.
we can start to change our relationship with procrastination.
So instead of beating ourselves up for procrastinating,
Right, which never really helps.
No, I don't.
We should try to understand the reasons behind it. And then the book offers some really practical strategies for dealing with it.
okay, like what?
Things like breaking down large tasks into smaller chunks,
Okay.
setting deadlines, rewarding yourself for progress.
Those sound pretty familiar.
They do, right.
Yeah.
But the book emphasizes that by approaching these strategies with a mindful awareness of our own tendencies, we can be much more effective.
So it's not just about the techniques themselves.
No.
It's about the mindset.
Exactly. It's about bringing that mindfulness to the process.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Okay, so we've talked about mindfulness, meditation,
Yeah.
emotional intelligence,
Yeah.
and even procrastination.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. What else does the book explore in terms of the practical application of Buddhist principles?
Well, it goes into a lot of different areas.
I'm especially curious about the concept of reincarnation.
Okay.
Does it delve into that?
It does, but in a way that might surprise you.
Okay, so
It acknowledges that death is a universal human experience.
it is.
Something we all have to confront eventually.
Yeah.
But instead of viewing death as an ending, it presents it as a
A
transition.
transition?
Yeah, a continuation of the cycle of existence.
You mean like reincarnation?
Well, the book doesn't explicitly endorse or deny the concept of
Okay.
Instead, it explores the idea of consciousness and how it might exist beyond the physical body. It even delves into scientific research on near-death experiences
Wow.
and the neurological processes during the dying process.
So it's not about blind faith.
No.
It's about examining the evidence
Yeah.
and considering different possibilities. But how does all this talk of death and dying connect back to finding peace and clarity in life?
That's a great question. Here's the connection. The book suggests that contemplating our own mortality can actually be a powerful motivator for living a more meaningful and fulfilling life.
Okay.
You know, if we truly understand that everything is impermanent, including our own physical bodies,
Yeah.
maybe we can face death with less fear and anxiety
I
and
think
embrace
so.
the present moment more fully.
It's a profound perspective.
It is.
I can see how that shift in thinking could have a ripple effect on how we approach every aspect of our lives. But I'm also curious about the role of Buddhism in the wider world.
Okay.
We've talked about personal transformation, but does it have anything to say about social justice or environmental sustainability?
That's a great question, and it leads us into the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
where we'll explore how Buddhist principles can be applied to create a more just and compassionate world.
Okay, I'm ready for part 3.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to think that these ancient principles could actually hold the keys to solving some of the biggest problems that we face today.
Right?
I'm really curious to see how the book connects those dots.
Well, what's really striking is that Buddhism doesn't separate personal enlightenment from social responsibility.
Okay.
It actually argues that these two things are intertwined, that when we cultivate inner peace and compassion, it naturally leads to a desire to create a more just and harmonious world.
So it's not about escaping from the world's problem.
No, not at all.
It's about engaging with them.
Yes, but from a place of wisdom and compassion.
Okay, I see.
And the book uses climate change as like a really powerful example.
Okay.
It suggests that by understanding our interdependence with the planet, recognizing that our actions have consequences
Right.
that ripple outward,
Yeah.
we're going to be more inclined to make choices that benefit the whole, even if they require personal sacrifice.
That's a really powerful point.
It is.
It's not about guilt or fear-mongering.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we're all part of this
Yeah.
intricate web of life.
Exactly. We're all connected.
And the book goes beyond environmental issues, right?
It does.
It talks about how Buddhist ethics can provide a framework for building a more just and equitable society.
Exactly.
So you're talking about the 5 precepts.
Yes.
The guidelines for ethical conduct.
Right. Those guidelines that we touched on earlier.
Exactly.
And just to recap, those involve abstaining from harming living beings,
Okay.
stealing, sexual misconduct,
Okay.
lying, and intoxicants.
Right.
And it's important to note that these aren't just like rules.
Right.
They're really about cultivating a deep sense of respect and responsibility,
Yep.
not only for ourselves, but for all beings.
So it sounds like it's about shifting our focus
Yeah.
from me to we.
Exactly.
Recognizing that our actions impact others.
Yes. In really profound ways.
And the book takes this even a step further, right?
It does.
With the concept of right livelihood.
Yeah.
Encouraging us to choose professions that are aligned with our values and that contribute to the well-being of society.
Exact. So it's about finding work that's not just a paycheck,
Right.
but that's actually a path to make a positive difference.
I love that idea.
Me too.
Bringing our values into every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, not just compartmentalizing them.
But for someone who's just starting to explore Buddhism, where do they even begin?
That's a great question because it can feel a bit overwhelming
It can.
with all these concepts and practices.
It does feel like drinking from a fire hose.
It can. And the book actually offers some really practical guidance for those beginning their Buddhist journey.
Okay, like what?
Well, it emphasizes finding a teacher or a mentor,
Okay.
joining a sangha.
A sangha.
Yeah, it's a community of practitioners.
Okay.
And then engaging in regular study and meditation.
So it's about finding support and guidance.
Exact, not trying to go it alone.
And I imagine there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
No, you're absolutely right. The book really encourages exploration of different traditions and approaches,
Right.
finding what resonates with you personally.
So it's a path of self-discovery,
It is.
not a rigid dogma.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's about experiencing the transformative power of these teachings for yourself.
That's powerful.
It is. And the book shares stories of individuals who have found peace, clarity, and purpose through their engagement with Buddhism.
So it's not just an intellectual exercise.
No.
It's a lived experience.
Exactly. It's about putting these principles into practice and seeing how they can transform your life.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's opened my eyes to a whole new way of thinking about suffering, happiness, and the interconnectedness of everything.
It's amazing how these ancient teachings can still be so relevant today.
It is. I'm definitely inspired to explore these ideas further.
Well, if you are, I highly recommend checking out Buddhism for the Rational Mind.
Where can people find it?
It's available on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep exploring.